In the vast
For your
empire of Rome,
crimes against the
where
majesty
architectural
of
marvels
Rome,
towered over the
you are
landscape and the
sentenced
echoes
to
of
death.
political power reverberated through the streets, there was an underlying darkness that few truly understood. The grandeur of Rome was not just built on stone and marble, but on a deep, unshakable belief in the sanctity of power and the harsh methods required to maintain it. But beneath the shining surface, there lurked a brutal reality. Death wasn't always seen as a finality in Rome. Often, it was regarded as a form of mercy, an escape from a life of unbearable suffering or dishonor. It's in this chilling paradox, death as both a punishment and a form of grace, that the most shocking Roman practices were born. The people of this empire, admired for their sophisticated culture, military might, and legal prowess, held beliefs and rituals that are now considered deeply barbaric. Yet, what made these practices even more unsettling was not just their cruelty, but the fact that they were woven into the very fabric of Roman society, viewed as necessary, even honorable, acts in the eyes of both the ruling elite and the masses. What was it that allowed a society to embrace such extreme measures of punishment? How did death, so final in its nature, become a tool of both justice and mercy? To understand this, we must delve into the psyche of the Roman Empire, a civilization that found its foundation not just in conquest but in the very control over life and death. To them, death was not simply an end but a process, a cleansing, a purification, or a release. The Roman worldview, governed by their belief in honor, duty, and the will of the gods, shaped the ways in which they dealt with crime, betrayal, and punishment. These were not just acts of vengeance. They were deeply tied to concepts of fate, divine will, and moral rectitude. From the public execution of traitors to the torturous deaths of those who violated sacred oaths, death was often seen as a necessary part of a larger cosmic order. In the eyes of the Romans, these punishments served not only to rid the empire of its wrongdoers but to reaffirm the natural order, where the strong and loyal triumphed and the weak and dishonorable were purged. But even as Rome thrived in its military conquests and political dominance, it was haunted by a quiet, unspoken truth, that some of its most horrific practices were so deeply entrenched in its social, religious, and political systems that to question them would be to question the very fabric of Roman identity. The concept of mercy in the context of Roman punishment was so perverted by power and fear that what we now deem as the ultimate cruelty was, in their eyes, a necessary evil. As we unravel the darkest corners of Roman history, we will come face to face with practices that not only defy our modern sensibilities but that reveal just how far the empire was willing to go to maintain its order, and how death, in the brutal logic of Rome, was often the only mercy one could receive. The Roman Empire, with its awe-inspiring feats of engineering, vast territorial conquests, and complex political structures, was a society built on a foundation of fear and control. For the Romans, everything, from their military prowess to their governance and religious practices, was bound by one unbreakable principle: power must be maintained at all costs. The psychology behind Roman governance was rooted in dominance, the desire to subdue and overpower all who threatened the stability of the empire. But this power was not achieved simply through military conquest. It was reinforced by the brutal methods of social control, which included a chilling approach to justice and punishment. At the heart of Roman society lay the concept of honor, both personal and collective, and the need to enforce that honor through fear of punishment. In a world governed by strict hierarchies, the survival of the state, and the individual's position within it, depended on upholding these hierarchies through fear, respect, and ruthless retribution. This was not just a political necessity, it was a deeply ingrained aspect of Roman culture and law. Romans believed that justice, in its most fundamental form, was not a matter of fairness or rehabilitation, but of demonstrating the superiority of the state over the individual. The legal system in Rome, while advanced in its structure, was savage in its execution. Punishments were not simply about retribution or deterrence but were also seen as acts of purification, a means to cleanse the wrongdoer and the community. The very notion of mercy was intertwined with death, as some forms of punishment were considered too severe to be borne alive. The belief was that the soul of the transgressor could only be freed from their sins through suffering, and often, death was seen as the only escape from this cycle of misery. The Romans did not just impose physical punishments. They executed a deeply psychological war against their citizens, using terror as a tool to maintain order. Underpinning all of this was a sense of fatalism, the belief that life and death were not in human hands, but in the hands of the gods. Rome's religious structure reinforced this worldview. The Romans believed that the gods directly influenced their lives and that justice, whether through punishment or mercy, was a divine act. This belief gave the state a sense of moral righteousness in carrying out brutal punishments, as it was not simply the will of the emperor or the lawgiver, but the will of the gods themselves. The Roman legions, the backbone of the empire's military might, were perhaps the clearest example of this psychological dynamic. Soldiers were not just warriors, they were indoctrinated into a system of discipline and loyalty so strict that the fear of punishment loomed over them at all times. Desertion or disobedience could lead to decimation, the act of randomly selecting 1 in every 10 men to be executed by their fellow soldiers. This practice wasn't just about punishing an individual, it was a stark message to the entire legion. Failure to conform to the highest standards of Roman military discipline would lead to a public, collective reckoning. The psychological weight of such punishment reinforced the sense of control, but also terrorized the soldiers into blind obedience. Roman law also permeated civilian life with a strictness that bordered on paranoia. Those who violated the social order were often met with cruel and unusual punishments. Treason, adultery, and perjury were offenses that could lead to swift, brutal retribution. In the eyes of the Romans, even the slightest hint of disloyalty to the state or the gods was a matter of life or death, and mercy was something that had no place in such a society. A betrayal of Roman values was a betrayal of Rome itself, and punishment was not just about dealing with the individual wrongdoer, but about maintaining the integrity and purity of the empire. But the most unsettling aspect of Roman justice was not just the severity of the punishments, but the philosophical justification for them. The Romans truly believed that their harshness was necessary for the survival of the empire and the preservation of its moral fabric. In this worldview, mercy was not just ineffective, it was seen as weakness. To show mercy to an enemy, a traitor, or even a criminal, was to risk the entire system unraveling. The Romans maintained their grip on power not by appealing to the notions of forgiveness or rehabilitation but by maintaining an iron-fisted control over their people, instilling a deep fear of punishment in every citizen. This underlying philosophy of fear, loyalty, and divine retribution created a society where the very idea of mercy was inverted. Death was not always seen as the worst fate. For some, it was an escape, a final release from the torment of life under Roman rule. The psychological grip the empire had on its citizens was absolute, and it is within this brutal, unforgiving context that we begin to understand the perverse practices that defined Roman justice and punishment. The very idea that death, in its most horrific forms, could be a form of mercy challenges our modern understanding of morality and punishment. Yet for the Romans it was a logical and necessary conclusion. Death, in their eyes, was the only true freedom. One of the most infamous and horrific practices within the Roman military was decimatio, a form of punishment that left a permanent scar on the psyche of both the soldiers and the Roman Empire itself. The word itself is a chilling reflection of its execution. Decimatio comes from the Latin decimus, meaning 10th. This brutal form of punishment was employed in the Roman legions as a means of maintaining discipline, instilling fear, and enforcing absolute loyalty. However, it did more than simply punish, it broke the human spirit in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend today. The practice of decimation was carried out when a military unit, often a legion or a cohort, was deemed to have committed a grave offense. This could be desertion, cowardice, disobedience, or any act that threatened the integrity and unity of the Roman army. When decimation was decreed, 1 out of every 10 soldiers in the unit was chosen by lot to face death. The chosen men were then executed by their fellow comrades, typically beaten or clubbed to death, in a public display meant to strike fear into the hearts of the surviving soldiers. The brutality of the act was not just about the physical execution, but the psychological torment that followed for those who were left behind. Imagine the horror. A soldier who had fought side by side with his comrades, sharing the same blood, sweat, and fear on the battlefield, now forced to participate in the death of his closest friends. This act of betrayal, in the eyes of the Roman military, was essential for restoring order, but the personal toll on the survivors was immense. These men were not simply soldiers, they were part of a brotherhood, bound by shared experiences and hardships. And now they were being forced to kill 1 in every 10 of their own. The act of killing a fellow soldier was not just a matter of obedience, it was an emotional and psychological devastation that would haunt the surviving soldiers for the rest of their lives. This punishment wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological, designed to break the spirit of the entire unit. The soldier who was forced to carry out the execution was not just executing a comrade, they were participating in a brutal reminder of what could happen to them if they ever showed weakness or disloyalty. The camaraderie that existed between soldiers, forged through the horrors of war, was shattered by the cold, calculated violence of decimatio. The soldiers' sense of identity, honor and loyalty to their comrades was twisted into something darker, something broken. The psychological damage inflicted upon the survivors was immense, and many would carry the trauma of this event with them for the rest of their lives. This form of punishment was a powerful tool used by the Roman leadership to reinforce the idea that loyalty to Rome was paramount, that the empire's needs superseded all personal attachments and feelings. Loyalty to one's comrades, to one's unit, to the Roman state, all of these were values that were instilled in soldiers from the moment they were recruited. But decimation took that loyalty and twisted it into something monstrous. It created an atmosphere of fear where death was always a potential consequence of failure, and that fear was not just about physical death. It was about the death of bonds, the destruction of friendships, and the corrosion of the human spirit. The idea of decimation also highlights the Roman military's obsession with order and discipline. In an empire that prided itself on its military might, the Roman leadership was not willing to tolerate failure in any form. Defeat, insubordination, or even a momentary lapse in duty could lead to decimation. It was not a punishment reserved for just the guilty. Even the innocent were sometimes caught up in its grim web. This cruel form of collective punishment ensured that no one in the unit would dare step out of line. The fear of being chosen was a constant, gnawing presence, and it kept the soldiers in line, even if that line was drawn at the expense of their very humanity. The psychological ramifications of decimation were far-reaching. Soldiers who survived it often lived with an unshakable sense of guilt and shame. They could never forget the faces of their fallen comrades, nor the horrific image of having to carry out their deaths. For some, this guilt led to a permanent sense of detachment from their comrades, unable to reconcile the brutality of what had occurred with the bonds they once shared. Others became deeply mistrustful of the system they had once served, their loyalty to the Roman state shattered by the cold, calculated nature of decimation. In many ways, decimation turned soldiers into mere instruments of war, stripping them of their humanity and reducing them to instruments of fear and control. But decimation was not merely a tool of punishment for soldiers. It was a method of psychological warfare, an insidious form of social control. It served as a stark reminder to all those who witnessed or heard of it that the power of the Roman state was absolute, that its wrath would not be tempered by mercy, and that betrayal or failure could lead to the most horrifying of fates. To witness decimation was to witness the sheer power of the Roman Empire, a power that could demand the ultimate loyalty from its soldiers, even if it meant forcing them to turn their weapons on their own brothers. The practice of decimation left a dark mark on the Roman military, one that would forever alter the way soldiers viewed their role within the empire. It was a tool that reinforced the Roman belief in the absolute necessity of control, discipline, and loyalty. But it also revealed something far more sinister about the nature of power, the lengths to which the Romans would go to maintain their dominance and crush any hint of dissent. It was a horrifying reminder that in the Roman Empire, death wasn't just the end, it was a weapon used to keep the entire empire in line, to break the spirit of the individual, and to remind everyone of the high cost of loyalty. In ancient Rome, few things were as sacred as the concept of fides, the oath of loyalty, trust, and allegiance. To betray one's fides, especially under Roman law, was seen as not only a personal violation but a direct affront to the gods and the moral fabric of Roman society. The fides that a Roman swore, whether to his family, his emperor, or his comrades, was unbreakable, and breaking it could lead to punishment of the most severe and often horrific kind. This was the Roman world, a world where honor, loyalty, and the preservation of reputation were worth any price, including death. And for those who broke their sacred oaths, death was often the most merciful escape from a fate far worse. The very structure of Roman society depended on the inviolability of trust. The ideal of fides shaped the relationships not only between the citizens of the empire but also between them and their rulers. When someone pledged their loyalty to the emperor, the gods, or even to a fellow citizen, it was not seen as a simple verbal agreement. It was a bond that bound the individual to a much higher purpose. To break that oath was to reject the entire structure of Roman civilization, and in doing so, one would face not only the wrath of the state but the wrath of divine judgment as well. The most horrifying aspect of violating fides was that the punishment for such betrayal was rarely a swift death. Instead, it was a slow, torturous path designed not only to punish the individual but also to serve as a public example of what would happen to anyone who dared break the sacred bond of loyalty. The Romans believed that dishonor, once stained upon a person, could not be washed away easily. Therefore, those who were guilty of such betrayal were often subjected to extreme forms of public humiliation and painful executions, designed to not only extinguish their lives but to burn their souls with the weight of shame and dishonor. One of the most terrifying punishments for the breach of fides was damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of a person's memory and legacy. This punishment was typically reserved for individuals who had committed acts of treason, betrayal of the empire, or grave violations against the Roman people. It was not enough to simply execute them. The Romans sought to erase the very existence of these traitors from history. Statues were destroyed, names were removed from inscriptions, and any trace of their life or deeds was obliterated. The idea was that the memory of the betrayer was so foul that even the gods themselves should not know of it, for the traitor's very soul was thought to be cursed. This punishment was especially effective in a society like Rome, where legacy and honor were everything. To have one's name and legacy erased from history was seen as an infinitely worse fate than a mere execution, for it was an eternal death, a death in the eyes of time itself. However, damnatio memoriae wasn't always the fate of traitors. In some cases, when the betrayal was of the most serious and profound nature, the Romans would reserve a far darker fate: the punishment of the parricida, those who killed a family member, particularly a father. The ultimate betrayal was not just to one's country but to one's own bloodline, to one's ancestors and to the very gods that governed Roman familial structure. The punishment for parricida was one of the most grotesque and brutal in Roman history, and it reflected the deep psychological horror that the Romans associated with this form of betrayal. The condemned was sewn into a sack along with various animals, such as dogs, snakes, and even monkeys, and then cast into the sea or river. The idea behind this execution was that the body of the parricida should be drowned alongside the creatures that symbolized their moral impurity. The symbolic nature of this punishment was chilling. It reflected how deeply the Romans viewed familial loyalty as a sacred, divine law. But betrayal didn't just take the form of familial treason or violent rebellion. It could also be seen in less overt acts, such as those of political betrayal. The betrayal of one's fides to the emperor or to the state could lead to similar forms of public punishment. A person who betrayed their allegiance to Rome, who broke their oath of loyalty to the empire, could be publicly executed in the most gruesome ways, often involving extreme forms of torture that were meant to humiliate and dehumanize them before their inevitable death. These executions were often carried out in the Forum, the heart of Roman public life, where they could be witnessed by all. The purpose of such public spectacle was not just to execute the traitor, but to remind the people of Rome of the importance of loyalty to the empire, a loyalty that was demanded, enforced, and, when violated, mercilessly punished. The punishment for breaking fides wasn't just a mechanism of justice. It was a way of enforcing social order. The Romans believed that loyalty, both to one's comrades and to the state, was the foundation of their strength as a society. Without loyalty, without fides, their entire system would collapse. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it justified the most horrific of punishments, even when the transgressions might seem trivial to modern sensibilities. For example, the punishment for breaking a promise to a superior or failing to keep an oath to a fellow citizen could result in exile, execution, or worse. To break one's fides was to disrupt the very harmony of Roman civilization, and such disruption could not be tolerated. For the Romans, the ultimate consequence of breaking fides was not just death, it was the death of one's soul. The psychological horror of these punishments went far beyond the physical suffering. The feeling of being cast out of the human collective, the loss of one's honor, and the destruction of one's legacy were thought to be more agonizing than the physical pain of execution. Death, for a Roman, might come as a release, but dishonor and betrayal could doom a person to an eternity of torment. The sense of existential fear that gripped anyone who feared breaking their oath was palpable, and the consequences of betrayal were felt far beyond the individual. They threatened the very stability and sacredness of the Roman way of life. Thus, breaking fides was not merely an act of personal failure, but a cataclysmic disruption to the social and moral order. The punishments were a reflection of how deeply the Romans valued loyalty and honor, and how terrifying the consequences could be when that loyalty was shattered. In the end, those who betrayed their fides did not just face physical death, but a more horrifying fate. They became ghosts in the empire's memory, erased from history, dishonored by their own society, and cursed by the gods themselves. In ancient Rome, the concept of punishment for women who transgressed social norms was as brutal and unforgiving as it was gendered. Women who were found guilty of breaking the law or violating societal expectations faced punishments that were uniquely horrific and often far more severe than those endured by men. One such punishment, especially for women who violated sacred vows or were suspected of disobedience, was damnatio ad bestias, a public execution where the condemned woman was thrown into an arena to face wild animals. The penalty was not just for the criminal acts committed, but a symbolic ritual that represented the punishment for failing to uphold Roman ideals of purity, family, and religious duty. Women's roles in Roman society were highly defined and often centered around the domestic sphere, bearing children, managing the household, and maintaining the honor of the family. The Roman world viewed women as the bearers of a family's reputation and moral standing. If a woman's behavior failed to meet the stringent expectations placed upon her, the consequences were severe and publicly humiliating. The penalty for adultery, infidelity, or even perceived defiance against a male figure of authority was often a brutal form of social and physical punishment. For the most devout women, those who were pledged to the gods as Vestal virgins, the consequences of betrayal were particularly severe. These women, sworn to chastity, carried a sacred responsibility to maintain the purity of Roman religious rites. The sacred fire they tended was symbolic of Rome's prosperity, and the state placed immense trust in their virtue. Any failure to adhere to their vows was considered not just a personal betrayal but a betrayal of the Roman gods themselves. If a Vestal virgin broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was reserved for the most heinous of crimes: live burial. The act of burying a woman alive was designed not only as a punishment but as a ritualistic act of divine retribution. The Vestal virgin was placed in a small underground chamber with just enough provisions to survive for a time, but the inevitable result was her death. The public nature of this ritual execution made it even more chilling. To watch a woman, once revered and respected for her purity, suffer such a gruesome fate was an act of horrifying spectacle meant to remind the people of Rome of the unbreakable laws governing both the divine and mortal worlds. The ritual was a display of absolute control over women's bodies and their roles within Roman society, a grim reminder that their value was entirely bound to their chastity and obedience. But even outside of the sacred confines of the Vestal virgins, Roman women who broke societal norms found themselves subject to equally gruesome punishments. Adultery, for example, was an offense that could result in a woman's execution by damnatio ad bestias. In these instances, a woman found guilty of infidelity was often stripped of her dignity and thrown to wild beasts in the arena, where the animal would tear her apart before a bloodthirsty crowd. While men too could be punished for adultery, the punishment for women was far more extreme. Women were not simply seen as individuals but as integral parts of a family's honor, and their transgressions, particularly in the realm of sexuality, were viewed as a direct assault on that honor. A woman's infidelity represented more than a personal failure. It was a public affront to her father, her husband, and even the broader state. Her punishment was, in a way, the punishment of the family, an act of collective cleansing. Beyond the context of infidelity, Roman society placed a significant burden on women when it came to their roles as wives, mothers, and daughters. Disobedience, particularly against a father or husband, was viewed as an unthinkable violation. Roman fathers had near absolute power over their daughters and wives, and this power extended into the realm of life and death. A woman who was caught engaging in disobedience, whether by rejecting a marriage arrangement, leaving her husband, or engaging in public defiance, could find herself subjected to cruel and violent retribution. While the punishment might not always be death, the emotional and social consequences could be equally devastating. For women, these societal norms created a prison of compliance, and any form of rebellion against male authority was met with terrifying consequences. The legal and societal systems in place further reinforced the idea that a woman's life was not entirely her own. Roman women, especially those of the upper classes, were often married off to further political or familial alliances, and their actions were constantly scrutinized. A woman's reputation could be irrevocably damaged by rumors or accusations of impropriety, and in such cases, the consequences were swift and unrelenting. The damage to a woman's honor, whether through accusations of infidelity or defiance, was seen as a stain that could never be washed clean, and the punishment was often a public spectacle to reinforce the gravity of her transgression. While women in the Roman world were expected to submit to the authority of their fathers, husbands, and even the state, the punishments they faced for failing to do so were far more severe and degrading than those of their male counterparts. A man who broke the law could often find refuge in a swift death or a brief period of exile, but a woman who betrayed her vows, her family, or her society's moral codes faced a much darker fate. These forms of punishment were not just about deterrence. They were about making an example of women, showing the population what would happen to those who failed to adhere to the strict codes of Roman conduct. The horror of seeing a woman torn apart by wild beasts in the arena, or buried alive for breaking a sacred vow, reinforced the chilling control the state exerted over women's lives and bodies. This deeply ingrained patriarchy in Roman society ensured that women were not only punished for their perceived moral failings but were also consistently reminded of their position in society. Their value, their safety, and their place in Roman society were all tied to their chastity, obedience, and submission to male authority. A woman's punishment, particularly when it was public, was a brutal reminder of the lengths to which the Roman state would go to ensure that women remained subservient and compliant. These punishments, whether through damnatio ad bestias, live burial, or the violent consequences of breaking a sacred vow, served to reinforce the rigid boundaries within which Roman women were expected to operate. Through these horrifying methods of punishment, we see a society that not only controlled but also actively subjugated women, using death and humiliation to maintain order, power, and patriarchal dominance. While Rome's legacy is often celebrated for its achievements in law, architecture, and governance, the dark truth of how it treated its women is a stark reminder of the brutality that often accompanied its power. The punishment of women in ancient Rome wasn't just a matter of justice. It was a way of enforcing societal norms, keeping the delicate balance of power intact, and ensuring that women remained in their place, as tools of family honor, controlled by male authority, and subject to the most horrific consequences if they dared step outside of it. The extreme and unforgiving climate of the Roman world, where both the environment and society demanded resilience and fortitude, played a significant role in shaping Roman ideas of punishment. This harsh reality, coupled with the deep-rooted belief in purification through suffering, gave rise to a range of torturous executions and punishments. The Romans believed that pain was not just a means of retribution, but a form of transformation, an ultimate test of endurance and a purification of the soul. These brutal punishments were not only a way of dealing with crime but were deeply tied to the cultural and philosophical belief that suffering, even in its most horrific forms, could cleanse an individual and restore the moral order of society. The Roman world was a place where suffering was woven into the very fabric of life, from the brutal conditions of military service to the harsh realities of life in the city. The Romans saw this suffering as an essential part of existence, a concept that extended into their methods of punishment. For the Romans, physical punishment was a way of reaffirming their beliefs about life, death, and the afterlife. It was an expression of both their understanding of justice and their religious worldview, which held that the gods demanded suffering as a form of both penance and atonement. This belief in the redemptive power of pain led to some of the most horrific forms of punishment in history. One of the most infamous of these was crucifixion, a punishment that has become synonymous with Roman cruelty and that continues to evoke both horror and fascination. Crucifixion was reserved for the most serious of crimes: insurrection, treason, and the most grievous offenses against Roman authority. But the act itself was not just about punishing the body, it was about sending a message to the population. The process of crucifixion was slow, agonizing, and public, designed to strip the victim of all dignity and to break their spirit over a prolonged period of suffering. In its most basic form, crucifixion involved the victim being nailed or tied to a wooden cross, where they would be left to die, usually from a combination of exhaustion, asphyxiation, and shock. The pain of the process was so intense that it could take days for a victim to succumb to their injuries. It was not a quick death. It was a prolonged and humiliating ordeal that stripped the individual of their humanity and left them to die in front of an audience. For the Romans, the purpose of crucifixion was not just to execute the criminal. It was to serve as a public spectacle, a lesson to others about the consequences of defying the state. This slow death was meant to be a cleansing process, a form of ultimate punishment that left no room for redemption. The act of dying in such a public and painful way was seen as a fitting end for those who had committed offenses against the state or the gods. In this sense, crucifixion was not just about physical death but about moral death, the complete and total destruction of the individual's identity and their standing in society. For the Romans, to be crucified was not merely to be executed, it was to be erased from history, to become a symbol of ultimate shame and suffering. But crucifixion was not the only form of punishment that sought to purify the individual through suffering. The Romans also employed a range of other brutal methods to enforce their moral and social order, many of which were tied to their belief in the sanctity of the family and the importance of upholding familial honor. In a society that valued honor above all else, crimes that violated family relationships were considered the most egregious offenses. For women, particularly, the punishment for violating family honor was often both cruel and uniquely gendered. One of the most extreme punishments in Roman law was reserved for women who committed parricidium, the killing of a parent, especially a father. This crime was viewed as the ultimate betrayal, a violation of the natural order, and it was met with an execution that left a deep mark on Roman society. The punishment for parricidium was known as pena culiae, and it was a grisly spectacle. The condemned individual, typically a man or a woman found guilty of the crime, was sewn into a sack along with various animals, often a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. The sack was then thrown into a river or the sea, and the person would drown, entangled with the animals, in a gruesome and symbolic death. The punishment was not just about retribution, it was a form of purification. The Romans believed that the only way to cleanse the soul of such a deep transgression was through a painful and demeaning death, one that left no room for redemption. The victim was not merely killed, they were humiliated, symbolically made to suffer alongside animals, and erased from the human collective. It was a death that marked the individual as an outsider, beyond the realm of human society and the gods. But even when a person's offense was less severe, the Roman idea of punishment was often extreme in its severity. The Roman Empire was a place where death was a constant presence, where the line between life and death was often blurred. In a world where war, violence, and political intrigue were everyday occurrences, punishment had to be just as extreme. The ancient Romans saw punishment as a tool of purification, both for the individual and for society. The act of suffering, even in its most brutal forms, was viewed as a way of restoring balance and order, a necessary step in maintaining the moral fabric of the empire. This harsh worldview extended to the Roman military as well. Soldiers, who were often subjected to extreme physical hardship and danger, were also subjected to brutal punishments when they failed to live up to the Roman ideals of discipline and loyalty. The Roman military system was built on the premise that discipline and obedience were paramount, and any failure to meet these standards was punished severely. Desertion, insubordination, and even the smallest sign of weakness were met with swift and violent retribution, often in the form of decimatio, the practice of executing 1 in every 10 men of a unit that had committed an offense. The Roman belief in suffering as purification was not limited to the realm of punishment. It was an essential part of Roman life, woven into the very fabric of their military, their social systems, and their religious practices. Whether through the brutal spectacle of crucifixion, the humiliating punishment of parricidium, or the systematic torture of traitors, the Romans believed that suffering had the power to cleanse, to restore order, and to ensure that the moral balance of society was maintained. This deep-seated belief in the redemptive power of pain and punishment left an indelible mark on the Roman Empire, shaping not only their methods of dealing with crime but also their understanding of life, death, and the forces of fate. For the Romans, suffering was not something to be avoided, it was something to be embraced, for it was through suffering that one's character was tested and refined. And for those who failed, punishment was the ultimate purification, a way of restoring balance, cleansing the soul, and ensuring that the empire's moral and social order remained unbroken. In ancient Rome, the gods played an essential role in the everyday lives of its citizens, but their involvement extended far beyond rituals and prayers. Roman religious practices were deeply interwoven with the legal and societal systems, creating a worldview where the divine and the mortal realms were inseparable. Punishments, particularly the most brutal ones, were not just human constructs. They were seen as divine actions sanctioned and executed with the gods' will in mind. This belief in divine retribution and justice formed the foundation of Roman punishment, and nowhere was this more evident than in the practices surrounding the most extreme forms of suffering, rituals and tortures that were believed to be not only acts of punishment but acts of divine purification. To the Romans, suffering was a means of atoning for sins, proving one's loyalty, and ensuring that balance was restored to the cosmic order. The Romans' view of suffering as purification was rooted in their understanding of the gods, particularly the major deities like Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, who were seen not just as arbiters of fate but as active participants in the human experience. To the Romans, their gods weren't distant or abstract. They were deeply embedded in the moral fabric of Roman life. The gods were believed to be ever-present, watching over human actions, and it was often through suffering, particularly violent or humiliating forms of punishment, that humans could atone for their sins or gain favor. It was as if suffering, in its most extreme form, was a direct means of communicating with the divine, of making amends for wrongs, and of proving one's worth to the gods. Take, for example, the case of crucifixion, one of the most horrifying punishments in Roman society. For the Romans, it wasn't just an act of state-sanctioned violence, it was also viewed through a religious lens. To be crucified was to be subjected to the wrath of the gods, to endure a punishment so severe that it was thought to cleanse the individual of any sin or wrong. This process of atonement through suffering was seen as a necessary purification, particularly for those who had committed acts of treason or rebellion. In Roman thought, these crimes weren't just violations of human law, they were offenses against the gods themselves. Crucifixion therefore became a ritualistic cleansing, a public display of divine judgment that symbolized the gods' ultimate authority over human life and death. The act of crucifixion was more than just physical agony, it was a prolonged experience of spiritual humiliation, where the individual's very soul was laid bare for all to see. The condemned person was nailed to a cross in a public space, often left to die slowly, their suffering displayed for the entire city to witness. The process was designed to be as excruciating as possible, a way for the individual to demonstrate their willingness to suffer for their crimes and, ultimately, to prove their contrition. Through this suffering, it was believed that the individual would be purified, not just in the eyes of the empire but in the eyes of the gods, as they endured the punishment for their sins. But the punishment of crucifixion was not the only method by which the Romans believed that suffering could restore balance to society. The infamous blood eagle ritual of the Vikings has parallels in Roman practices, where suffering was viewed as both a form of punishment and purification. However, one of the most striking examples of divine punishment in Roman society was reserved for those who were accused of sacrilegium, the offense of desecrating the sacred rituals or objects of the gods. In these cases, the punishment was seen as not just retribution but as an act of cleansing for both the individual and the state. The most severe punishments for sacrilege involved rituals that were deeply tied to the Roman belief in the necessity of balance in the divine order. For example, sacrilegium often resulted in public executions, but the manner of death was deliberately chosen to align with the cosmic need for balance and purification. The person found guilty of desecrating a temple, a statue, or a sacred object was often executed in a way that symbolized their offense against the divine, such as being dragged through the streets, stoned, or, in the most severe cases, thrown into the Tiber River as an offering to the gods. These executions weren't just about the death of the criminal, they were seen as offerings to the gods, a necessary ritual to appease the divine forces and restore balance to the empire. It's clear that the Romans didn't view punishment as merely a human institution but as something that was inherently divine. The gods had the final say in all matters including justice. The punishment of criminals was not just an act of the state, but an act that aligned with the will of the gods. In this worldview, the gods were active participants in human suffering, sometimes bringing punishment themselves in the form of plagues or natural disasters, and at other times, using human hands to carry out divine will. To the Romans, this connection between divine justice and human suffering was not only inevitable but necessary for the continued success of the empire. It was believed that only through the purification of the sinner could Rome remain safe from the wrath of the gods. The psychological toll on those involved in the execution of these punishments, particularly when they were seen as divine acts, was immense. Roman soldiers, tasked with carrying out executions, were not simply executing criminals. They were, in their eyes, instruments of divine will. The stress of carrying out such acts was immense, as many Romans believed that to carry out punishment was to be in direct communion with the gods. The weight of this responsibility could break even the most disciplined soldiers, who were faced with the brutal task of carrying out divine judgment upon their fellow citizens. The Roman belief that suffering, even in its most brutal and public forms, was a necessary part of restoring balance to society and ensuring the continued favor of the gods permeated every aspect of their legal and punishment systems. From the gruesome rituals of the gladiatorial games, which were a form of both entertainment and divine appeasement, to the public spectacles of torture and execution, the Roman Empire used suffering as a tool to enforce moral order and reaffirm their bond with the divine. But the religious aspect of Roman punishment was not limited to the physical acts of retribution. It also found its way into the very language of punishment. Words like pena, punishment, and justitia, justice, were deeply tied to divine law, reflecting the belief that human justice could not exist in isolation from divine will. Punishments were framed as necessary acts of purification, designed not only to correct the behavior of the criminal but to ensure that the moral balance of the universe was maintained. The connection between divine judgment and earthly punishment in Roman society was so ingrained that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The gods demanded justice and the people carried it out, often through unimaginable cruelty. Through these religiously inspired punishments, the Romans sought not only to punish but to purify, to create a society where order was constantly restored by the will of the gods. Whether it was a form of public execution, the ritualistic sacrifice of a traitor, or the brutal act of crucifixion, The Romans viewed these acts as not only necessary but sacred, a necessary cleansing to ensure that divine favor rested upon the empire. In their eyes, suffering was the ultimate form of atonement, and the gods demanded it to maintain cosmic and social order. The execution of these punishments, deeply intertwined with the gods, will reinforce the idea that justice, no matter how brutal, was a divine mandate. The Roman Empire, at its zenith, was a vast and powerful entity, a symbol of order, discipline, and unyielding authority. But underneath this towering structure of power lay a darker truth, a belief that cruelty, suffering, and punishment were not only necessary but sacred. To the Romans, there was no sharper contrast than between the grandeur of their empire and the brutality of the punishments they administered. As brutal as the methods were, they were also seen as mechanisms for maintaining order, ensuring loyalty, and appeasing the gods. Punishment was not simply about enforcing laws, it was an essential part of Roman life, so deeply embedded in the culture that it was viewed as an ultimate form of justice, a sacrifice of the body and soul, necessary to maintain the purity and integrity of the state. The most shocking aspect of Roman punishments, especially in relation to crimes against the state, was the manner in which they blurred the lines between retribution and ritual. The punishment for betrayal, treason, or desertion was never just about the death of the individual, it was about sending a message to the masses. In ancient Rome, even the most horrific punishments were framed within the context of ensuring social harmony and divine favor. The belief was that without these extreme measures, chaos would reign, and the gods would withdraw their protection. The Romans saw their empire as being under the constant watch of deities who required ritualistic offerings, and the greatest offering of all was the purification of souls through suffering. To betray the state was not merely to break a law, it was to defy the gods themselves. And thus, the consequences were always severe. The Romans did not simply punish traitors, rebels, or deserters in the conventional sense. These criminals were often subjected to executions that were as much about public spectacle as they were about death itself. The most famous form of public execution, crucifixion, was not just a death sentence but a brutal ritual. It was meant to send a message about the power and unassailable authority of Rome, about the fate of those who dared defy it. The victim was often left hanging for hours or even days, exposed to the elements, mocked and degraded not just physically but spiritually. The act of crucifixion was framed as an offering to the gods, a gruesome, painful sacrifice meant to ensure Rome's continued dominance and divine favor. The condemned person, stripped of all dignity and humanity, was forced to endure prolonged agony. Their suffering was both an offering and a display of the state's power. It was a divine act of purification, a violent spectacle in which the soul of the condemned was thought to be cleansed through their suffering, while the spectators were reminded of the terrifying power of Roman law. Crucifixion, like all Roman executions, was designed not only to destroy the body but to obliterate the very identity of the individual. Once the condemned person was executed, their memory was erased. It was as if their existence had been wiped from the very fabric of Roman life. The ruins of Persepolis rise like ghosts from the desert, stone columns piercing the sky, their shadows long and solemn beneath the dying Persian sun. The wind hums through corridors that once echoed with prayers and decrees, carrying the faint memory of a civilization that believed its power was divine. These stones were meant to be eternal, built by kings who thought they had mastered both time and truth. Yet now, only silence remains, a silence heavy with the weight of forgotten screams. Persia's empire was born from order, but sustained by fear. To the kings, cruelty was not chaos, it was control. Punishment became the language of obedience, and pain the grammar of empire. The same belief that led them to carve paradise into the desert, with gardens flowing like rivers of heaven, also led them to devise punishments so exquisite in their torment that they defied the limits of imagination. For the Persians, beauty and brutality were not opposites. They were reflections of the same divine symmetry. The ruins themselves seem to know this truth. Look closely and you can almost see it, the contrast etched into every pillar. The soft curve of a lotus flower beside the unyielding gaze of a soldier. The carved faces of captives standing beneath gods of fire and justice. In their perfection, there is unease, as if the stone remembers what it was forced to witness. The empire's grandeur was built upon obedience, but that obedience was born from terror. Every act of cruelty carried the illusion of divine purpose, and that illusion, more than any weapon, held the empire together. But time does not honor illusion. Time erodes it. The same sun that once gleamed off royal thrones now burns the ruins bare. The same sands that buried traitors now swallow the names of kings. History, in its quiet vengeance, buries cruelty not beneath condemnation but indifference. The empire that once sought to shape eternity is now nothing but dust, its legacy scattered across half the world, its punishments remembered only in whispers. And yet, Persia's true legacy did not die with its stones. It lived on, in philosophy, in empire, in the eternal pattern of human power. The idea that pain can serve order, that cruelty can be righteous, became a seed that took root in civilizations to come. The Romans called it justice. The inquisitors called it purification. Dictators would later call it peace. The language changed but the essence remained. Every age finds a way to sanctify its own cruelty. When we look back at the Persians, we see not monsters but mirrors. They were humans, driven by faith, fear, and the desire for permanence. Their cruelty was born not from madness but from belief, the conviction that suffering could restore harmony, that terror could preserve truth. And in that conviction lies the deepest warning history can offer, that the greatest evils are always committed in the name of order. Even today the echo of Persia lingers. Every time a government claims violence is necessary, every time pain is dressed as justice, every time control is mistaken for peace, the spirit of ancient Persia rises again, silent and unrecognizable but undeniably alive. The tools have changed, the justifications have evolved, but the essence remains the same. Humanity still worships the illusion that cruelty can build paradise. But the ruins say otherwise. The stones of Persepolis speak through their silence. They remind us that no empire, however divine it believes itself to be, can escape decay. The Persians thought they could burn impurity from the world with sacred fire, that they could cleanse rebellion with suffering. Instead they burned themselves. Their empire crumbled not under invasion, but under the weight of its own righteousness. For when cruelty becomes honor and pain becomes sacred, even the gods turn away. And yet, there is something hauntingly beautiful in their failure. The Persians reached for perfection, for divine order in a world of chaos, and in their reach they revealed the eternal contradiction of humanity. We seek peace but build it through violence. We worship beauty but create it from suffering. We chase immortality, but are destroyed by the very means we use to grasp it. As the last light fades over Persepolis, the ruins glow like embers, the remnants of a fire that once claimed to be eternal. And in that glow, history whispers its final truth, that cruelty, no matter how divine its disguise, always consumes its creator. Empires fall. Fates fade. But the memory of pain endures, carved deeper than stone, echoing longer than any king's name. Persepolis stands not as a monument to Persian greatness, but as a mirror, reflecting the unending cycle of human ambition and the price it demands. The empire is gone but the lesson remains. When power learns to justify pain, it writes its own epitaph. The legacy of Roman punishments, especially the most brutal and public executions, continues to echo throughout history. At the core of Roman justice was a belief that punishment was not only necessary for maintaining order but also for purifying the soul. The cruelty, though horrific by today's standards, was seen as a divine act, an act that the gods demanded to maintain moral and cosmic balance. Public executions such as crucifixion were not only meant to punish but to send a message to all citizens. It was a spectacle that reaffirmed the unassailable authority of the empire. In Roman eyes, suffering was not just a physical event. It was a cleansing, an offering to the gods to ensure Rome's continued prosperity. While many of these punishments seem unthinkable today, they were deeply embedded in the Roman worldview. To the Romans, a crime against the state was a crime against the gods themselves, and thus, retribution had to be as severe as possible to restore order. But even more unsettling was the psychological toll these punishments took on both the condemned and the public. Being publicly executed or having one's memory erased through damnatio memoriae was not just a punishment of the body, it was a punishment of the soul and legacy. The condemned individual was erased from history, forgotten by the empire they once lived in. These acts of extreme punishment were not just tools of justice. They were deeply connected to Roman religious beliefs and the idea of divine retribution. To the Romans, purging the guilty through suffering was a necessary act for the preservation of their empire. Even today, as we look back at these practices, the fear they instilled in the Roman population is palpable. The cruelty was not just about enforcing the law, it was about demonstrating the absolute power of the state and the gods. And in the process, the legacy of Roman justice, with its emphasis on brutal retribution, remains a stark reminder of the cost of maintaining order and control.